Okay, everybody, here we are. We are live. Good morning. Happy Friday to those of you who made it through the week. It is great to have you here watching the live stream, ready for another fun day where we talk about charts that you all have donated to me via social media. Right now, we're going live on Facebook and Instagram. I'm currently trying to figure out how to go live on Instagram and TikTok at the same time, so that will hopefully be a thing. But yeah, so we're going to be taking 5 charts, we're going to be breaking them down, teaching you a little bit of astrology, giving some guidance, and just overall having fun. As a reminder, if you would like to be on the live stream, you can always private message me your birth date, birthplace, and exact birth time. I do need those 3 details to run an accurate chart. And if you would like to work with me privately, you can always go to my website, scorpiorisingastrology.com, where I also have a lot of online classes that you can purchase as well if you're interested in learning astrology. But for now, we have 5 charts to get into, so let's go ahead and start unpacking those. So first and foremost, we've got Sonia. Sonia, good morning. How are ya? Cheers. So let's go ahead and take a peek at Sonia, shall we? So we've got a Scorpio ascendant separating from a conjunction with Neptune and Scorpio in the first, but Neptune and Scorpio in the first is still really significant from a physical standpoint. So as a medical astrologer, which is my chosen specialty because I have a background in medicine, so whenever I do chart readings like this, I always take into consideration the medical aspect of some of these placements. And when we have a Scorpio rising plus a Neptune in the first house, you know, Scorpio tends to be rather sensitive as a sign. All the water signs do, but to put Neptune, the secondary lord of Pisces, in the same house in the sensitive sign of Scorpio, it really just blurs boundaries. It really just makes the physical body a little bit more hypersensitive. Here we have that hypersensitivity located in the Scorpio body systems. We have the bladder, the reproductive, the colon, and the sinus. Those are going to be the 4 Scorpio body systems that we see hypersensitive in this person's chart because they have Neptune in the first house of the body. Let's see, what else? From that perspective, like we could also say metaphysically that this person is very tapped in spiritually, but tapped into a fault. Neptune tends to blur boundaries, and that's not always a healthy thing. We see a lot of Neptune activity in the lower expressions with escapism and addiction issues. We see it in the higher expressions of people who tend to throw themselves into spirituality. Another form of escapism, although we think of it as a healthy form of escapism, you know, it's still Neptune trying to blur, trying to confuse, trying to overly adopt or reflect the energy that I always like to compare Neptune to when it's strongly placed in the chart is the Fae, is the fairy realm. You know, they want to get you in, they want to feed you food, and then you can never leave again, and you're trapped there forever. And that's kind of the energy of Neptune, is the trickery, but trickery that's lighthearted, but it's not lighthearted, and that's kind of Neptune's way. So we have that in the first house of the body. So understanding, Sonia, that you're physically very sensitive to all forms of chemicals, and you need to take half the dose, if half, to feel the same amount of effects from any sort of medication or substance. And that's kind of just bred into your makeup via the chart. See, where's the ruler of the chart? The ruler of the chart, because we have Scorpio on the ascendant, is going to be Mars. Mars is up in Virgo and is retrograde in the 11th house of friendships. That's tricky. When we have the Lord of the chart retrograde, it indicates that the person's active potential of who they are as a person is often misinterpreted, or is slow to grow or to develop. And here we have Mars in Virgo, which is actually a very managerial type energy. I love Mars in Virgo because it's the farmer archetype. Yeah, it's the grain god archetype. We have Mars the warrior in the sign of Virgo, the manager, and it's very much somebody who's able to not just delegate the work but do the work as well and pick up the slack. But that Lord is retrograde in the 11th house. The 11th house is the house of friendships, of social groups, of philanthropy, lots of really fun stuff excuse me, lots of really fun stuff happening in this house. So I don't really like to see the Lord of the Chart retrograde here. That would mean that, you know, Sonia's managerial potential, her ability to really tap into those gifts is going to be not easy, especially for the first, let's see, Mars. A couple Mars cycles would put that through. It also depends on where Mercury is at. Oh, Mercury in Capricorn in the third. Okay, so, and Moon in Capricorn in the third. Okay, so one way that she might actually get around that is if she starts to teach. And if she starts to actually use her voice of the third house, where her Moon and her Mercury is at, as well as her Venus, really nice pileup of personal planets in the third house for Sonia. And she actually starts to use her writing, teaching, speaking abilities of the third house to activate her managerial style of the 11th house and corralling large groups. That Mars is also the ruler of the 6th house of work. And Mercury from the third is also ruling the 8th house of business. So I think overall, the teaching sphere, I think overall group communications, technology potentially, because the 11th house is something that I will associate with technology and social media. But then we also see that there is this very strong teaching component. So it's about understanding how powerful words are, about understanding how needed the voice is to speak up and to actually stand one's ground. All those things that Sonia would find difficult in the beginning of life, but would mature into some greater clarity in that respect. So that's nice. Let's see, where do we want to go next? We want to go to, let's go to the Sun in Aquarius in the fourth. So putting the Sun in the fourth really gives an ego identification with family. There's kind of like a, there's a selfhood tied to the family that tends to be rather strong, as in like, if the family unit is falling apart, you are also falling apart from an ego perspective because you've put the literal radiant heart of your chart into the fourth house of family. Now that can be an admirable quality. You know, a lot of people say home is where the heart is, and that's definitely a phrase that rings true with your chart. However, what I also find that can be a little bit toxic about this placement with people who have Scorpio rising is Aquarius is a naturally distant sign. Yeah. Aquarius is a sign that prefers to have its own space, that prefers to be the loner, that does not necessarily enjoy being I want to say understood, but Scorpio and Aquarius kind of have that in common. Right now I'm talking about Aquarius, darling, in the chart. So Aquarius as a sign, yeah, Aquarius as a sign. Sorry, comment section's just starting to go wild on Facebook and Instagram right now. Everybody's tuning in. So we're looking at this fourth house Aquarius Sun, and I think that there's conflict here because the Sun itself is about kind of bringing brightness and joy and self-confidence, but then we have it in the very cold Aquarius sign, which is rather distant. And so although you identify with the family dynamic very heavily, I think there's also this opposite feeling of like being in a room that's totally crowded, but also feeling totally alone. Yeah, and that can be something that needs to be worked at a little bit, and to tap into your own authentic self, because when you feel that feeling of, you know, it's what I'll refer to as cold touch. When somebody, like especially in body work, my massage background kind of coming in, when somebody goes to touch you and there's no energy behind their touch, there's no actual feeling behind their touch, it's just an empty gesture. Like that's kind of what we're seeing with that Sun in Aquarius. Like the Sun wants to make the family the source of the self, but it's ruling the 10th house of success, the opposite sign, and then we have the that Aquarius that's pushing the Sun down into its coldest spot, really. And that can be somewhat difficult to navigate. So we might need to unpack some feelings around how you fit into the family dynamic as one of the sore spots of your chart. Which I think is where the working with large groups comes forward and using your voice comes forward and managing comes forward, is because you start to identify other people's strengths, and you start to learn how to maneuver the chess pieces of the board in other social dynamics, so you can then move that to yourself and transfer those lessons that you learn in the field for what you do for a living into your own personal home dynamic, and you can kind of create better situations from there. Let's see. Then we have to look at this Jupiter and Taurus in the 7th. One of the interesting things that I always love to do when I look at a chart is look at the 7th house of relationships, because it really is so striking how you tend to pick the person that or tend to at least be attracted to the person that your chart kind of deems as worthy, or the qualities that your chart deems as worthy. And for you, anybody who has Scorpio rising has Taurus on the 7th, so you're naturally going to be attracted to somebody who's stable, who's almost painfully normal, who's grounded, who can be a rock, who can be both cuddly and comforting, but also enforce boundaries and make sure that they are both supporting you but not hindering you. Yeah, that's the essence of Taurus. But you also have Jupiter in Taurus in the 7th, and Jupiter is the planet of expansion. And so when we look at that, it's funny, because I always love Jupiter in the 7th house, because it means that you've got a big person on the line, and that could be physically in terms of stature. I know one of my friends that I read for on a regular basis. We always joke, because they have Jupiter in a particular sign in the 7th house, and their spouse of choice is just a linebacker, just absolutely massive. And I think that that's just funny. So we've got Taurus the bull, but Taurus the bull on steroids in your chart. And so you need that kind of physically commanding presence, even if it's not attached to that commanding or demanding energy that we would see in other signs. Taurus is sweet, is kind, but is still stable and fixed and earthy, which is very supportive for you and your process. Let's see. Final notes. No, I think we pretty much covered it all. I think, yeah, just really focusing on managing large groups of people, watching the hypersensitivity. Yep, that's pretty much it. Cool. Thank you, Sonia, for donating your chart. I very, very much appreciate it. Let's go ahead and check the comments. Good morning, everybody on Facebook and Instagram who is joining. We are going through our charts, which we do every week. And we are on chart number 2, who is Kenley. Let's take a peek at this chart. So speaking of Aquarius, we have Aquarius on the ascendant. Making Saturn the ruler of the chart. Saturn is also in a stellium in the 8th house. Interesting. There's also South Node component sucking the energy out of that first house Aquarius. That can be problematic. A Mercury in Cancer on the 6th brings that love into the equation. That bleeding heart in the mind. Sun in Gemini, how do I feel about that? We're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's walk through the chart step by step. So Aquarius ascendant, we talked about in the kind of last chart. Aquarius is the fixed air sign. It's known as the loner. It's known as the genius. Somebody who locks themselves in the tippity top of that tower to tinker, to kind of Rapunzel and isolate themselves away from the worlds and descend maybe 10 years or so, every 10 years or so with the cure to cancer. It's somebody who prefers to be above it all. And because of that, they're seen as quirky. They're seen as aloof, but they have that Albert Einstein energy to them, which makes them very interesting people. So that's stamped on your spirit with that energy being on your ascendant. We also have the South Node here in Aquarius, and this is where it gets a little bit dangerous from a medical astrology perspective, because the South Node is the energy suck of the chart. And having a Saturn-ruled chart already, the body is prone to being a little bit frail or slow to develop. And where you will find that frailty or that slowness to develop is going to be in your Aquarius body systems. The Aquarius body systems being the peripheral nervous system, the skin, and the calves. So what I see a lot with people with this South Node ascendant in Aquarius combo is they'll often develop childhood eczema, which they grow out of after they hit their Saturn return at 30, as well as constant restless legs, nervous disorders, which often feed the skin issues, and weird like carpal tunnel peripheral extremity nerve things that Aquarius is just prone to, which are not just, physical, they're also emotional as well, because Aquarius as a sign, their nervous system tends to be very high functioning, and that literal static needs a place to ground. Yeah. What I think can be a blessing and a curse about this chart is this Virgo stellium. I like the idea of Virgo pairing with Aquarius. I think that the mutable earth of Virgo and the fixed air of Aquarius are a nice partnership. They're a nice duality. It's nice to ground and anchor. But Aquarius and Virgo both tend to be very nervous signs. And so the anxiety level just starts to tweak just a little bit higher the more I look at this chart. Which is not necessarily ideal. We also have the moon in Virgo here, so we have a double dose of that kind of picky managerial energy, but also great attention to detail, very problem-solving. I like it. And this is all happening within the 8th house of business. So I think that's great. I think that's super fun. I think there's a strong entrepreneurial spirit with Saturn being present, Mars being present, Moon being present, Jupiter being present. There's a lot of entrepreneur stuff happening in the chart. And I like it even more because Jupiter is, although he's in fall in his sign of Virgo, he is ruling the second house of finance from that 8th house of business. So business ventures being rather successful when they are undertaken. I like it. The 8th house, the 8th house has a lot of interesting meaning. I'll take it to be business because there's a lot of business energy that's coming forward with Saturn being present and Virgo, the manager, kind of also being present. But then we also have the 8th house, which rules topics like taxes, yeah, other people's finances, banking to a certain degree. Those would all be excellent fields for you to work in, especially with Mercury in Cancer ruling the 8th house from the 6th house of work. But then also there is this idea of death. The 8th house being associated with death does indicate that, there is potential mediumship qualities, especially with the moon here, that sensitivity to those who have passed. But also just from a business perspective, like the money aspect of the world, I think is very, very ingrained into this chart, not just because of Saturn, but also because of Virgo, Mercury being involved nicely, especially with the great mutual reception between Mercury and Cancer and the moon in Virgo. There's a really nice synergy there, which I love, especially between the two business and work houses. Like, it's great. There's a lot of really nice career stuff. Just love the career stuff in this chart. I don't think that that's going to be a problem too much. Yeah, the one thing that we need to make sure of is to keep you focused and not to drop projects once they seem irrelevant. But Saturn will also take care of that and keep you a little bit more grounded. That's fine. Okay. Sun in Gemini in the 5th is interesting. I keep using the word interesting. I need to stop that. But it is. It's so interesting, this chart. Because there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces. Because what's interesting about this chart as well is we have the Mercury in the 6th house of work, health, pets, right? Ruling the 8th house of business where the stellium is at, but then also ruling this 5th house where his sun is at. And this is going to be the 5th house of children, parenting, sexuality, and creativity. And so when I see this connection, there's often going to be a lot of creative work that's being done and or working with children. Because the sun is also here, there's a heavy identification as the parent, as a creative, as somebody who's supposed to be bringing things into the world. Uh, and I like that as part of, when we think of entrepreneurs, we often think of them as business people. But if you've ever been an entrepreneur, one of the things that you know is that your business is like your baby, like especially in the early stages before you start to become a little bit more detached and you start to understand how business works. Like each business you make is like it's like a piece of you. It's like something you're bringing into the world, and I think that that fits really, really lovely with this chart. For sure. Mercury in Gemini retrograde, that might be an issue with the muses that we may need to work out. Too much logic, too much rational thinking. We might need to petition Venus to bring in a little bit more artistry into the work, a little bit more mess, a little bit more slop, a little bit more of that raw creativity. Because there's a lot of neatness in this chart. There's a lot of doing things for reasons, yeah, as opposed to doing things because you love them. And I think that that might be a problem with this chart, because there is a lack of that creative Venus force. She's in a little bit of a pickle, which she might need to be freed from, especially because she's naturally opposing and retrograding back into an opposition with Neptune in Sagittarius. So there may be actual friend distractions and or social substance distractions, because Neptune in Sagittarius is all about thrill seeking, really, in the 11th house of friendships and social groups. And that really doesn't leave time to connect with creative juices. It's like you work hard, you play hard, but that play hard distracts from your actual creativity, and the work hard distracts from your actual creativity. You're doing hard, hard, hard. Yeah, whereas Venus is soft, soft, soft. She needs to be coddled. She needs to be nurtured. She needs to be loved and appreciated and adorned. And you can't do that when you're, going 100% at work and then 100% at fun. There's no room for the creative energies to flow, to move forward. Yeah, so that's a little bit tricky. That's a little bit tricky. What else? What else? Yeah, I don't see issues with success in the chart. I do see a good probability of children, because the North Node in Leo constantly kind of pokes you to find a spouse. The spouse that you have will be very oriented towards children, may also be a creative just like yourself, but the idea of the Sun in Gemini in the 5th house of children, ruling the 7th house of relationships, children will be a major factor of the relationship regardless. But the North Node in Leo is a fascinating placement in the 7th, because it means that you're constantly in need of that spouse to complete you, which I think in your chart is important, because you're naturally attracted to somebody who's a little bit more fiery, a little bit more spontaneous, a little bit more free-spirited than you are, and having that energy that's not necessarily your friends trying to, take you on another road trip, but a little bit more of that spontaneous glow as opposed to a bursting firework. Yeah, that's kind of where we're headed in the spousal direction. Not that wildfire out of control, but somebody who's able to create a nice hearth for you. Yeah, to gaze into the flames and receive artistic inspiration. Cool. Thank you, Kenley, for submitting your chart. I very, very much appreciate it. Good morning, Yvonne. So glad that you enjoyed that reading. Let's go ahead. We'll move on to chart number 3. Chart number 3 is Matt. Matt, good morning. Cheers. I saw this chart. And I thought to myself, oh boy, we got some stuff to talk about. And immediately what we see in this chart is a Sag stellium. So Sagittarius, Sun, South Node in Sagittarius, Mercury in Sagittarius, Ascendant Sagittarius, Pluto in Sagittarius. Absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. With a Moon in Leo, Jupiter Leo in the 9th house ruling the chart, making a trine to all of this fiery nonsense. I absolutely can't. It's such a fiery chart. So combustible, so spontaneous, so thrill-seeking, so spiritual. Yeah, just so much that's happening. However, there are some pretty deep weaknesses in this chart as well that we need to kind of be aware of. Okay, so let's talk about Sagittarius, because we have a double dose of Sag energy in this chart, because both the Sun and the Ascendant are in Sagittarius, which means that we have kind of two of the primary three personal markers in that sign, giving you like lots of that energy. So Sagittarius is mutable fire, known as the seeker, known as somebody who is constantly searching for the Holy Grail, a perpetual optimist, somebody who enjoys nice humor, but also intellectual debate and discussion. Somebody who has a flair for the dramatic, but only if it lifts people's spirits and inspires them. Very much a bardic figure would be a good way to think about Sagittarius. Sagittarius is also associated with the archetype of the fool, not to indicate stupidity, but to indicate somebody who is just carefree and waltzing through life to the beat of their own drum and kind of just enjoying the ride for what it is. However, Sagittarius as a mutable fire sign is prone to change, is prone to indecision, is prone to being called a fool, yeah, for that indecision, or for being so spontaneous. So we need to understand both the helpful and the hurtful aspects of Sag in this aspect. From a physical perspective, having both South Node and Mercury in the sign of Sag is a little bit difficult for the body in this way, because Sagittarius rules the liver, as well as the blood vessels and the hips. And having Mercury, a sign which promotes weakness to a certain extent, and the South Node, which also promotes weakness to a certain extent, in that sign, we could have blood sugar issues, we could have upper digestive issues, specifically the ability to digest fat, with that liver gallbladder aspect going on. So I would suggest playing with a more plant-based diet if we start to get like baby poop syndrome. Not to be gross, but that's kind of what you'll see first and foremost. If gallbladder and liver are misbehaving due to dietary stuff, you'll see the poop start to become technicolor because the bile from the liver isn't being produced or stored appropriately, and that can be an issue. But also really weak or hypermobile hips, which would turn into low back stuff eventually, and like weird vein things like varicosities and things like that, even though there's a young slant to the chart. Okay. And what I said about spiritual, we kind of need to unpack this next as the major placement, because the Lord of the chart is Jupiter and Leo in the 9th. And this is, we actually had a chart last week that had a very similar placement. And when we see the Lord of the chart in the 9th, there are some things that automatically come forward. And it's the themes that will constantly revolve around the life regarding spirituality, travel, foreigners, and higher education. The need to study, the need to interact with foreign cultures, the idea of studying abroad, excellent, constantly traveling. But then also we have this spiritual essence, which I think is what I'm kind of picking up on more, because Jupiter is also in Leo. And when I see Jupiter in Leo, I think of an over-exaggerated faith, a faith that tends to be a little bit more showboaty. It's kind of like the dramatized faith that can be really cinematic, yeah, but can also be really annoying, right? So we just need to understand that the pompousness that can be associated with this Jupiter and Leo will be some of the social things that friends and family might need to kind of check you on just a little bit. Because it's one thing to surrender to the divine, but it's another thing to parade through the streets and trying to convert other people. Like it's not necessarily using your spirituality for the highest good. So we need to just rein in the drama king of Leo, rein in the Jupiter, the literal planet of expansion, just a little bit, and create some space for a true garden of spiritual knowledge to thrive. But the moon in Leo here, also your last of three personal placements being in the ninth, like so much around your life is going to surround travel, working with foreigners, higher education, spirituality. Wouldn't surprise me if you've already been on a mission trip or 2 or 3 or 6. But there's just so much in your chart that just calls for you to reach out, calls for you to help those in need, calls for you to use your faith in a way that really spurs not only your growth, but the growth of others, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. Let's see, where else do we want to go with this? I think we need to talk about Mars and Venus. And this is often something I see with charts that are really, really spiritual, actually, which I always find super cool, but also unique, is there's always something that happens with Mars and Venus. You know, they are, in some ways, they're the most human planets because they represent kind of our duality struggle as people. The idea of Venus representing yin and Mars representing yang. We could associate masculine, feminine, although I don't necessarily like the gender norms of the Mars-Venus placements. But one of the things that a Jupiter and Leo energy will do is to try to fuse the two into the one and ignore their dual principles. Yeah, if we just surrender to the one divine source, then all will be forgiven or all will be rectified. And Venus and Mars really feel slighted in that position because Venus, she's literally in her fall in Scorpio in the 12th house of hidden enemies. Like, that's a very dangerous placement. Like, you've got a swamp witch in your chart. You've got a sea hag in your chart. Like, she's very angry because she's been slighted, right? And Mars, the warrior, he's in Libra, a sign of his fall, right? That warrior energy, that conqueror energy is split in a million different directions and asked to ethically decide who to kill and who not to kill, and that never ends up well. So Venus and Mars, I think, need to be rectified a little bit more in your chart. I think we need to understand the masculine, feminine principles. I think we need to understand the yin-yang duality. I would highly suggest you study the Tao. I would highly suggest you study a lot more of the Eastern philosophies that are about balance and understanding the energetic polarities of the forces of our natural world, as opposed to kind of Sagittarius always striving for the one ideal. Yeah, Sagittarius is the archer, the arrow. Yeah, it tends to be single-pointed Sagittarius, although single-pointed in a million different directions, but single-pointed nonetheless. That Mars and Venus really do concern me because I think, one, it stops your ability to make friends because Mars in Libra, Mars in the sign of its fall, excuse me, in the 11th house of friendships is going to be tricky. Yeah, friendships are going to be over competitive, indecisive, and superficial. Yeah, at their worst. But then Venus and Scorpio in the 12th, there's going to be this constant subconscious nagging, and I really think that this is the more dangerous placement of your chart, because the 12th house is already a house that tends to be rather dark and spooky. Yeah, a little bit more karmic lesson. It's where those who fear to look at their own reflection in the mirror do not tread, right? And to have a literal monster in that space waiting for you, to have karmic baggage waiting for you about how you deal with the yin principles of your life, of rest, of surrender, in some cases of fertility, of the sexual mysteries with Venus being in Scorpio. I think that there's a lot that needs to be unpacked there. And I would highly suggest that you look into some of those archetypes. Specifically, one of the archetypes that I absolutely adore for Venus and Scorpio issues is the Medusa. The literal, lover who was transformed into a monster, all because the gods deemed her to be a threat. Like, it was of no fault of her own. And I think that that's kind of the Venus and Scorpio archetype at its finest. And you might struggle with that archetype, struggle with those lessons. So partnering with those kind of those divine conscious faces will definitely help to speed up your chart's progress, because there's a lot of ease here. There's a lot of ease here. Sag and Leo play very, very nicely, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should surrender or lean into that ease all the time. Yeah? If you've got some extra energy to spare and you're kind of floating on cloud nine, why not use it productively to descend and work on yourself, work on your self-esteem, work on your more well-rounded qualities of that young Mars and that yin Venus, and try to kind of heal those planets that are a little bit more afflicted in your chart. Excellent. So that is what Matt's chart has to say. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. And very, very much good luck to you. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Yep. Definitely. I can totally see the spiritual aspect coming in with the mediumship. That's totally a thing. Yeah, and that might be where the monster is as well. Okay. Moving on to chart number 4, we have Shauna. Shauna, good morning. We have, oh goodness, Shauna, we have some stuff to talk about, don't we? Yes, we do. Yes, we do, darling. Okay. So we have the ascendant in Leo. Brings a little bit of spark, a little bit of fire, a little bit of flames. For those of you who get that clue reference. So we have that fiery kind of Leo energy that's already setting us up for cool things. We have Mercury as well, Mercury and Leo, who's coming forward in the first house too. I like this Mercury and Leo combination in the first house. It brings the mind into a very active space, but fixed fire that is Leo also has control, also has a little bit of rigidity to it. And I like Mercury, who tends to be a little bit all over the place, having some semblance of control, but still being in an active fire sign. I like that. I like that. So the mind has a tendency to be on fire, yeah, but it's a controlled fire, and I'm good with that. But here we have some issue as we move into the next major signifier of the chart, which is going to be the ruler of the chart. And when we have Leo on the ascendant, the ruler of the chart is going to be the sun. And the sun is in Cancer in the 12th house. And this is not necessarily an ideal place for the sun to be. And here is why. So the sun in Cancer is good. It's not great, but it's good. One sign away from its natural rulership of Leo, which is nice. But the real issue here is the sun being in the 12th house in this chart. The 12th house is the house of hidden enemies. It's the house of deeper healing. It's the house of retreats. It's the house of hospitalizations, of jails. The way that I like to look at the 12th house is it's the place where people go to cook. Yeah. And whether they are the cook or whether they are the things being cooked is up to how they express the octaves of their placements. And when I say hidden enemies, right, this could be somebody who exposes hidden enemies, right? We have the sun, who is literally a source of light, yeah, who might bring a lantern into the darkness of the 12th for others, which would be a great thing, yeah? But at its worst, this sun lacks self-esteem. The sun lacks an ability to find its own identity. This sun has a tendency to over-empathize with others to their own detriment and to try to become or smother somebody else as a form of relating, which can be tricky. When positively placed, this makes a great therapist, you know? When negatively placed, this makes a terrible patient, right? So it's one of those things where we are in the 12th house of cooking. We are in the 12th house of spiritual development. We are in the 12th house of forced healing, would be a good way to say it. However, the choice of how that plays out is up to the decisions of the native and how well they choose to work with their sun. And the first thing I would recommend for this chart is solar remediation. We need to honor the sun. We need to bring his light forward. We need to set up an altar to the sun in the home. We need to petition the sun on Sundays with gifts of flame and fire and light, in order to bring that energy forward into the chart and to fuel the therapeutic process. So that's, if you take nothing away from this chart reading, that's a helpful skill. Should probably do a class on that at some point. Let's see, where do we want to go next? Ooh, but a nice well-placed Venus in Taurus. Yeah, I can get behind that. I can really get behind that. I like it. I like it. So a Venus in Taurus in the 10th. I mean, if there's one thing you'll be recognized for, it's your beauty. It's your ability to care for others. It's your ability to kind of have that earth goddess energy that just seems to exude from every, finger and toe. Very Demeter-esque, and as well as the North Node being here, learning to channel that energy effectively will be definitely a recurring theme in the chart. People will run to you as they would run to Gaia, Mother Earth, for nurturing and support and rest and healing. Absolutely lovely Venus. I'm a fan. But then we look at retrograde Pluto in Scorpio. We look at the South Node in Scorpio. We look at retrograde Saturn in Scorpio in the 4th house of family. And that is a very nasty blend. That is a very nasty blend. And that Mars is making an almost exact trine. That Mars in Cancer, which is also in fall in the 12th house, is making an exact trine to that South Node in Scorpio. Family issues, karmic family issues, the bullshit that's surrounding. We might as well just throw Mars on, throw up a Mars altar right next to the Sun altar as well. There's just so much that needs to be dredged from that family dynamic, from that family situation. Not a fan of that. Not a fan of that at all. To have Saturn in Scorpio retrograde, Pluto retrograde, South Node, ooh, no. You've got good pole vaulting ability because that Venus is touching, is in the same house as your North Node. I like that. So if we surrender into that green goddess archetype, I think that's safe. I think that that's delicious. I think that that's where you'll get a lot of your energy from. But the more you try to slink back or to try to play in the family dynamic, the more you're just going to keep coming up with that toxicity, that terrible toxicity. So we need to remediate that from a distance. Yeah. I know you had mentioned children. With Uranus and Sagittarius retrograde, the birthing process being rather unpredictable. Oh wow. How interesting. Within 1 degree. Within 1 degree, your Jupiter and your Uranus are in mutual reception. Jupiter in Aquarius, Uranus and Sag, both retrograde, in sextile, in mutual reception. Crazy, kooky weirdness. But see, that's the thing, is you love that. You absolutely love that. Don't tell me that you don't want things to always keep you on your toes. Don't tell me that you don't want things to always be interesting. I guarantee in the last week you've said, I just want things to be shaken up a bit, that's all. It's so quirky, and it's so wonderful, and it's so just kind of spasmodic. I really enjoy that formation. I really like it. It really brings a lot of great chemistry between you and your spouse. funky chemistry, like funky, weird, humorous chemistry, which I like. I enjoy that. I think that that's beautiful. Um, like the thought that comes into my head is like, oh, we should spice things up in the bedroom, and you like buy a lobster costume from Amazon, and that's your idea of spicing things up in the bedroom as a joke. Like, and that's the kind of relationship that you have. Like, I love that. I think that that's absolutely adorable. But we need to understand from a practical perspective, humor aside, and safe unpredictability aside, that Uranus and Sagittarius is going to make it just a little bit more difficult for the child aspect to be predictable. Yeah. So watch for things to be like, respect the idea that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Um, measure twice, cut once, right? Um, watch out for miscommunication, watch out for spontaneousness. Don't do anything quickly. Spur of the moment decisions are the enemy. Take a deep breath, count to 10 before you make a decision. Really understand your rights, understand who you're dealing with, what you're dealing with. Make sure you're surrounded by people that you can trust. Always get a second opinion when it comes to that fifth house of children. But you're going to bear a child who is just as quirky as you are, and I like it, and I like it a lot. But that Uranus energy is going to be just a little bit too quirky for me to think that something might not be tripped up in the process. So we just need to watch that a little bit more vigilantly, a little bit more carefully, have both eyes really open, and that eye in the back of your head, that mom eye, kind of fully activated, and use your intuition just a little bit, for sure. Okay. I think that's where we need to kind of stop for this chart. Excellent. Cool. Thank you, Shauna. So glad you found it interesting. We got one more chart to do. And it's Stephanie. Stephanie, my darling. Cheers, my fellow Scorpio rising. Okay, bitch. Let's see. What's going on? What's going on? What does the universe have to say about you? That's an interesting opposition. Lots of water in the chart. Strong water in the chart. Delicious water in the chart. Remediating water in the chart. Intuitive stuff. Money is so weird. Money is so weird. Okay. Anyway, so we have ascendant in Scorpio. Scorpio on the ascendant naturally starts to bring some fun things into the equation, starts to, as we unpack that sign, we need to understand that anybody with major Scorpio placements, especially if they're on the ascendant, double so for Stephanie because the lord of her chart, Mars is also in Scorpio in the first house, so she has lots of strong Scorpio energy in this chart. Scorpio is the sign that is naturally going to be defensive, but it is defensive because it is hypersensitive. And so we have that watery nature, but we have fixed water here with Scorpio. Fixed water we can think of as ice. Yeah, ice with a melted center. It's like the gooey filling is protected by a hard outer shell, even more so than Cancer. Scorpio has the venom, whereas Cancer just has the claws. Scorpio can kill you. Cancer can just pinch. And that's very different. Cancer reprimands. Scorpio goes for the kill, and that's a very different energy. As so ruled by Mars, right? And that's what we're talking about. So there is this very aggressive, very fiercely intuitive, very When we see especially Mars in Scorpio attached to the chart, especially in the first house of self, there's this ninja archetype that comes forward. You know, somebody who is a warrior, who is somebody who can, you know, get the job done from an assassination perspective, who is very focused on the task at hand, on executing, yeah, either metaphorically or literally. You'd be a great hitman, Stephanie. Just kidding. Or am I? You know, you can never tell with Scorpio whether they're kidding or not. But when we look at that Mars and Scorpio being so present, we just need to respect that there is this shadowy side, there is this dark side, there is this aggressive side that needs to be expressed, often through bloodshed, often through the more visceral expressions of Scorpio. That could be enhanced sexuality as well, because Scorpio does rule the reproductive system. But then also we have Mars ruling the sixth house of work, which happens in a Scorpio rising chart. But from the first house of the body, ruling a healing chart, the field of medicine is just a natural fit, but also health and pets, oddly enough. So we have lots of interesting healing. But how does a ninja heal, right? We find somebody who's very strategic, who gets in, gets out without being seen. It's very much it's the invisible knight, right? Would be a good way to think of it. But we also have a stumbling block here. We have Saturn in Scorpio retrograde, which is a pretty heavy placement. We also have technically both malefics in the first house, which is somewhat troublesome from a physical perspective as well, because the first house is the house of the body. Mars tends to bring inflammation. Saturn tends to bring restriction. Saturn is cold and dry. Mars is hot and dry. Dryness is their kind of co-present energetic. So we find an excess of dryness happening in the Scorpio body systems, which would be reproductive, which would be colon, which would be sinus, which would be bladder. Yeah. So those physical aspects we would just need to be very, very aware on the Scorpio body systems from a health perspective, making sure that those areas specifically are moisturized, are nourished, that the sensitive linings of the Scorpio body systems do not crack, do not dry, and that we are constantly coating them with practical things like hydration. Yeah, everybody thinks, water signs are very watery. They are, but because of that, they need more water than most. Yeah, and that's not just physical water internally, that's also external water. Like, I tell my water signs all the time, why are you not moisturizing? Yeah, especially if you have issues with your sensitive body systems, think about incorporating some mucilaginous foods. Think about incorporating some hydrating applications of balms, especially balms that you make yourself. It's really fun and easy to do at home. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about the next kind of set of placements. So we have Sun in Cancer, Venus Cancer, Mercury Cancer. I really like this. I like this formation a lot. However, from a traditional standpoint, both Venus and Mercury are combust. They are too close to the Sun, making them just a little bit problematic. And we have that opposition from Jupiter in Capricorn, which is just absolutely ridiculous. Paired with all of this stupid, just absolutely stupid stuff that's happening in Capricorn right now as it is, it's really hammering down on finances big time, like big time, not okay finance stuff. As soon as Jupiter and Saturn move out of Capricorn, December 19th, all of that will rectify. But right now, we have a lot of very intense personal energies that are just hammering away at these placements. Even though by degree they're somewhat far, still just the idea that they're sign-based all of this nasty Capricorn stuff in your third house of writing, teaching, communication, opposing very strong primary placements in Sun, Venus, Mercury, Cancer, up in the ninth house of spirituality, travel, foreigners, higher education. Like there's this stopping energy. There's this brake pedal energy that is really dulling your shine because your sun is here. And it's making things super difficult for all of that lovely solar radiance to shine. But what I think is fun, and what I've seen happen before, is when the sun is compromised, the planets that are combust the sun actually get a little bit more of a chance to get some free reign. So let me know if this has actually been the case. If Venus in Cancer and Mercury in Cancer are set free by some of that opposition, then one of the things that you'll notice is an increase in the mothering instinct of that Venus in Cancer. And because Mercury is in Cancer, ruling the 8th house of business, and Virgo, the 11th house of friendships, one of the things that will start to come forward as well is kind of social endeavors, entrepreneurial activities, and things that will stimulate the mind, but stimulate the mind potentially from a social group or a business perspective. Also, relationships will actually come forward because Venus is ruling your 7th house of relationships from the 9th. There'll be long distance relationships though, or relationships that revolve around heavy spiritual themes. Where else do we want to go in this chart? Where else do we want to go in this chart? We have a moon at 6 degrees can join the North Node in Gemini at 6 degrees in the 8th house of death, taxes, estates, business. Anytime the moon is in the 8th, there's this kind of I see dead people archetype, especially with Scorpio already being hypersensitive. Doesn't surprise me. You've got a double water sign on the ascendant. You've got your sun in a water sign as well. Why not throw the moon in the house of death and really kind of make it a trifecta and call yourself Hill House Incarnate? There's not that you're haunted, Stephanie. Not that you're haunted. Although you would love to be with all that Scorpio energy. Like Scorpio, one thing that Scorpio does like is a good romp through a graveyard. And I think that's just part of what completes your aesthetic. The moon in the literal sign of communication in the 8th house of death. Why not just complicate things with talking to people who aren't physically there? North Node in Gemini in the 8th is a very specific placement, though, that we need to understand. The 8th house rules other people's money, so often involved in business, but banking, clientele as well. And putting your North Node here and ruling it by your Mercury in Cancer in the 9th means that you should actually look at long-term expanding clientele internationally, and looking at however you choose to exercise your entrepreneurial placements. I would really encourage you to open up to an international audience, because what you're going to find is there's a lot more money to be made overseas for you, and that will actually be a really lovely thing. And if we use other people's money instead of your own money, we get out of this terrible financial house. If you don't already have a CPA, if you don't already have somebody who's literally, in some ways, taking your money away from you so that you don't misuse it, like we need some of that financial guidance, just a little bit, because the South Node is here. Uranus, the planet of unpredictability and the mutable sign of Sagittarius, is literally retrograde in this house. Neptune as well, retrograde in this house. Both planets, like, Uranus is unpredictability. Neptune is blurred boundaries. Sagittarius is mutable fire, who's also known for blurred boundaries. South Node, the energy suck up the chart. Like, there's so much in the 2nd house of finance that just says, don't touch your own money, right? We need to implement auto saving. We need to implement like limits and rules to your financial spending. We need to make sure that money is really, really looked at very sternly very conservatively and bring in some more stable placements to that house, especially because that second house of finance is ruled by a very detrimented Jupiter, very detrimented Jupiter. Jupiter in Capricorn, the sign of his detriment, retrograde backwards in the third house of writing, teaching, communication. We need to do some Jupiter remediation, like big time. I would set up a Jupiter altar. I would offer alcohol, spirits to Jupiter. He really appreciates a nice, deep, dark, rich, highly alcoholic beverage. Something like a rum, something like a Italian dry Merlot, all those things for Jupiter. And yeah, that's where I think we should end with the chart, is just remediate Jupiter for finance. That would be good, for sure. Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Instagram is about to time out, which means I've been doing this for about an hour. This has been lovely. This has been super fun. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. I appreciate you. We will be back on Monday to do this again. Have a fantastic weekend in the meantime. Remember to check in on my profile page or on Instagram for the daily posts. And if you would like to schedule a private consult, you can always hit up my website at scorpiorisingastrology.com. If you would like to learn astrology, you can also download some of my classes. If you would like to be on the live streams, feel free to private message me your birth date, birthplace, exact birth time. We will add you to the list. But in the meantime, may the stars be ever in your favor.